A single breath before the great doors opened, Ceres pressed her thumbnail into her palm hard enough to leave a mark, because pain was the one thing in the hall she could still control. On the other side of that oak, 300 wolves of Kaldmark were waiting to watch the last daughter of Izmir kneel to the man whose grandfather had burned her family's banners. She had been told to smile. She had been told to walk slowly. She had been told, above all, to give them nothing, because a conquered woman who weeps only teaches her conquerors that weeping is allowed. The door swung wide and the light hit her like a hand across the face. The hall of Kaldmark had been built to make people feel small. Its ceiling vanished into shadow far above the torches, and its floor was a long river of grey stone that seemed to stretch for a mile between the door and the raised hearth where he stood. Ceres had never seen so many faces gathered to look at her, and she understood at once that not one of them had come out of love. They had come to see the old blood bent at last. They had come to see whether she would break. She did not break. She walked. The whispers began before she reached the middle of the hall. A woman near the front said something behind her hand, and the man beside her laughed low in his throat. Somewhere a child asked why the Izmir girl looked so plain in her own wedding, and the mother did not hush him quickly enough. Caris kept her chin level and her eyes forward on the tall figure waiting at the old hearth, and told herself that a wall could not be wounded by weather. Then she looked at him properly for the first time, and her certainty faltered. She had expected a monster. Rumor had built the Alpha King of Coldmark into something out of a nursery warning, a giant with a scarred jaw and a killer's stillness. The stillness was there. So was the height and the breadth of shoulder that made the two guards beside him look like boys. But his face, when she found it, was not cruel. It was tired. He watched her come toward him with an expression she could not read at all. Dark eyes steady under a hard brow, his mouth a flat and patient line, and for one foolish instant she let herself hope that a tired man might also be a kind one. She reached the foot of the hearth. The keeper of rights raised his hands and the hall fell silent. The binding of Coldmark had 4 movements, and Ceres had been made to learn each one until she could recite them in her sleep. First came the naming of the houses, the dead one and the living. Then the joining of hands above the old hearth, where the fire never went out. Then the drawing of the mark, the old magic that would tie the crown to her blood and make him a true king in the eyes of the mountain. And last, the king's own word, freely given, without which the whole rite meant nothing. The keeper named the houses. His voice carried the fall of Izmir as though he were reading a shopping list. The king offered his hand above the hearth, and Ceres laid hers upon it, and she felt how warm his palm was, and hated that she noticed. The keeper drew the mark. Something cold and bright bloomed along the inside of her wrist, a thread of silver light under the skin, and it climbed her forearm like frost spreading over a window, and it did not stop until it reached the bend of her elbow. It did not hurt. That was the part no one had warned her about. It did not hurt at all, and somehow that was worse. Only the king's word remained. Caris lifted her eyes to his, and for the length of one heartbeat, she saw something move behind them, something that looked almost like regret, and her traitor heart leaned toward it. Valen of Kaldmark bent his head so that only she would hear, and he spoke. "I married you only for the crown," he said. His voice was quiet and even and colder than the mark on her arm. "Expect nothing of me. Do not mistake this hall or these vows or this hand for anything you might one day be tempted to want. You are a key. I am the lock you were made to open. That is all we are, and all we will be." He straightened. To the hall he raised their joined hands, and 300 wolves of Coldmark roared their approval of a marriage that had, in the space of a single whispered sentence, already ended. Garris smiled, because she had been told to, and behind the smile she thought, very calmly, that she would rather have faced the monster. They did not speak again that night. There was a feast, because there was always a feast, and Ceres sat at the king's right hand and ate almost nothing, while the great families of Kaldmark came one by one to look at her the way farmers look at borrowed cattle. She learned their faces because she had learned long ago that names and faces were the only weapons a hostage was ever allowed to keep. She learned the fat lord who would not meet her eyes and the thin lady who met them too long. And she learned, above all, the man who came last. He was younger than the king, and handsomer in the loud way that fades, with the same dark hair and none of the same stillness. He bowed to her far more deeply than her rank required, which was its own kind of insult, and when he rose, his smile was warm and his eyes were not. Cousin, he said to Valen, though he was looking at her. You might have told me she was lovely. I would have contested the match myself. Osric, the king said. That was all. But Ceres felt the temperature of the table drop, and she understood that she had just met the second most dangerous person in the room, and that the first was the man she had married. Osric did not take the hint, or rather he took it and set it aside like a dish he did not care for. He drew out the empty chair on her other side and folded himself into it as though he had been invited, and he began to talk. He told her that the north of Kaldmark was very cold, and that she would find it hard, coming from the softer country of Izmir. He told her that his cousin was a serious man, a soldier to the bone, and that she must not expect laughter from him, for the king had left his laughter somewhere on a battlefield years ago and never gone back for it. He said all of this kindly, smiling, and every word of it was a small blade slipped between her ribs, and she understood that he was measuring her, testing where the soft places were, the way a man raps his knuckles along a wall listening for the hollow spot. She gave him nothing. She thanked him for his concern and asked, in a voice as sweet as she could make it, how long he had lived at his cousin's court, and whether he found it comfortable to be so near the throne without ever quite sitting on it. Something cooled behind his eyes. He recovered at once, laughing as though she had made a fine joke, but she saw that she had landed a small hit of her own, and she filed away the knowledge that Osric could be stung, because a hostage learns to keep every weapon she is handed, even the ones that draw no blood. Across the table she caught the king watching the exchange. His face gave away nothing at all, but when Osric finally rose and drifted off toward a knot of lords by the fire, Valen leaned a fraction toward her, not enough for anyone to mark it, and said, "Lo, that was unwise." She looked at him. "He does not forgive being made small," the king said. "Neither," said Ceres, "do first." And for the space of a breath something almost like respect moved across that hard, tired face before the stone came down over it again. Later, when the hall had emptied and the torches had burned low, Valen walked her to the door of the chambers that would be hers. He did it because it was expected, and she went because refusing would have given the watching servants a story to carry down to the kitchens. At the threshold he stopped, and for a moment neither of them moved. "You will have questions," he said. "I have one," said Ceres. "If you wanted nothing from me but the crown, you might have taken the mark and locked me in a tower and left me there. Why the feast? Why the hall? Why let them all watch you make me your wife when you had already decided I would never be one?" Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "Because Osric was watching," he said. "And Osric counts weaknesses the way a miser counts coin. A king who hides his bride looks like a king with something to hide." She stared at him. "So I am a shield," she said. "Not even a key. A shield you hold up so your cousin cannot see whatever it is you are truly afraid of." He did not answer, and his silence was an answer. "Sleep, your grace," Valen said, and turned to go. Then he stopped, and without looking back he added, in a voice she almost missed, "Do not walk the north corridors alone. Not at night. Not for any reason." And then he was gone down the dark stair, and Ceres stood alone at the door of her own marriage, rubbing the silver mark on her arm and wondering why a man who felt nothing for her had just told her how to stay alive. Odalis was waiting inside, which was the only mercy the day had offered. The old woman had come with Keris from the ruins of Izmir, the last living soul who remembered the house as it had been, and she had the gift of being invisible when it served and immovable when it did not. She had been a girl in the Izmir court in its last good years, a maid to Ceres's grandmother, and she had carried the child Ceres out of the burning capital wrapped in a horse blanket while the towers came down behind them. In all the years of quiet exile since, through every cold hall and every borrowed roof, Odalis had stayed, because there was no one else left to stay, and because a promise made to a dying queen is not the kind of thing a woman like Odalis sets down. She was the closest thing to family Ceres had, and tonight, in a strange keep on a strange mountain among people who wished her gone, that was worth more than the whole of Kaldmark. She helped Ceres out of the heavy wedding clothes without a word, and only when the door was barred and the shutters drawn did she reach for her lady's bare arm and turn it toward the candle. She went very still. "It has already climbed past the elbow," Odalis said. Ceres looked down. In the hall the mark had stopped at the bend of her arm. Now, hours later, the silver frost had crept 2 fingers higher, fine as lace, cold as a coin left out in snow. It was beautiful, in the way that thin ice over deep water is beautiful. She had known it would spread. She had not known it would spread this fast. The keeper said one rite a night for the first cycle of the moon, Sarah said, to root the crown. He said the mark would settle once the binding took. He said what he was told to say, Odalis answered. She was quiet for a long moment, and in that quiet Ceres heard everything the old woman did not want to speak aloud. She had heard it once already years ago from her dying grandmother, but she had been a child then, and children are good at believing that terrible things belong to other people. She was not a child now. Say it, Ceres told her. The binding does not take from the crown, Odalis said. It cannot make something from nothing. Every rite that roots him deeper draws its strength from the only Esmir blood left living. From you. Each night you make him more truly king, the mark climbs, and when it reaches your heart. She stopped. She could not finish it, so Ceres finished it for her. Then I die, Ceres said. The word sat in the small warm room and did not feel real. And Kaldmark gets its true king, and Osric gets his cousin's grief, and the last daughter of Izmir gets a very fine tomb. There is worse, Odalis whispered. The binding is a bargain, and a bargain has a rule, and the rule is this. If the king ever learns the cost, if he learns that the crown is bought with your years, the magic breaks. And a broken binding does not simply end. It takes the king it was tying, and the blood it was drawing from both, in the same hour. If Valen learns what this is doing to you, Ceres, it does not save you, it kills you both. Ceres sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. So I cannot tell him, she said. Not to spare myself. Not even at the end. I have to let a man who married me for a crown go on wearing that crown, and I have to hide from him the fact that it is killing me, because the truth would only kill him too. Yes, said Odalis. Ceres laughed once, and it was not a good sound. He told me tonight to expect nothing of him, she said. It seems I am the one who must give everything and let him never know it was given. Odalis sat down heavily beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then the old woman took Ceres's marked hand between her own dry ones and held it, the way she had held it when Ceres was small and frightened of the dark, and she said that Ceres's grandmother had known this day would come. The old queen had made the marriage bargain herself in the last winter of the war, when Izmir had nothing left to trade for peace but its blood and its future. She had known what the binding would ask of whichever granddaughter carried it, and she had wept over it, Odalis said, wept as Ceres had never seen her weep before or since, and then she had dried her face and signed the treaty anyway, because a queen spends what she has to spend, and all she had left to spend was the child. Ceres sat with that a long time. She had spent her whole life resenting the grandmother who had sold her into a stranger's cold hole, and now she found the resentment had nowhere to stand. The old woman had not been careless with her. She had been cornered, exactly as Ceres was cornered now, choosing the least unbearable of a set of unbearable things. Perhaps that was the true inheritance of the Izmir women, Ceres thought. Not a crown, not a country, both of those long gone. Only this, the narrow art of paying with yourself and holding your face still while you did it. I do not know how to do this, she admitted, very quietly, into the dark, to die by inches and smile at the man it buys a throne for. No one knows how, Odalis said. They only do it, or they do not. She squeezed the marked hand once more and let it go. And you are your grandmother's blood. You will do it. Outside the shuttered window, far below in the dark, a wolf began to howl, and then another, and then the whole mountain seemed to answer. Ceres pulled her sleeve down over the climbing silver and did not sleep. The court of Kaldmark took 3 days to decide how to hate her, and then it settled on its method with the relief of people who have finally found a shared hobby. They were too well trained to be cruel to her face. Instead, they were cruel in the space just beyond it, in the whisper that stopped when she turned, in the seat left empty on either side of her at the long table, in the way conversation closed over her, like water over a dropped stone. She was the conquered blood. She was the reason their king had bent his neck to an old magic instead of taking a strong Kaldmark wife. She was, one voice said carefully behind a pillar, meant to be sickly, these Izmir women. Thin blood, they never last. And Ceres had walked on with her chin up and pretended the words had not found the exact soft place they were aimed at. She learned to move through it. She learned that a hostage survives by being useful and unreadable, and she made herself both. and she might have gone on that way for the whole slow cycle of the moon, hiding her arm and swallowing the court's small poisons, if she had not gone looking for the one face that had shown her warmth. Izora had been kind to her on the second day. She was a distant cousin of the king, bright and quick and generous with her laughter, and she had sat beside Ceres when no one else would and told her which lords could be trusted and which could not. And Ceres had been so starved for a friendly voice that she had not stopped to ask why a woman of Kaldmark would befriend the thing Kaldmark despised. Now seeking her, Ceres was told the lady might be found in the old library in the west wing. And so she went, down a corridor of cold afternoon light, rehearsing the small, honest things she might finally say aloud to someone. That she was frightened. That she did not know how any of this worked. That she was so tired of being brave. She heard the voices before she reached the door, and she stopped because one of them was Osric. "You worry too much," Osric was saying. There was the soft sound of wine being poured. "She is already dying. Anyone with eyes can see it coming. The Izmir line was always going to gut her out. All we have to do is help it along a little faster, and quietly, so my dear cousin has the good grace to look grief-stricken instead of guilty. And when she is gone." That was Izora. Ceres knew the voice, the same warm, quick voice that had promised her which lords to trust, and something in Ceres's chest went cold and still. "When she is gone," said Osric, "the binding breaks clean, because a binding always breaks when the blood it holds runs out. And a broken binding to a dead queen is a very different thing from a king who learns a secret. The crown comes loose. It comes loose and it goes looking for the next man of the blood with the strength to take it." His voice smiled. "He is not the only one of us descended from the old king's cousin. He is only the one who moved first." Ceres pressed her back against the cold stone and did not breathe. They did not know she was dying by the right. They thought she was simply frail, thought the old blood was failing on its own, and they meant to hurry it. They did not know the truth of the mark, which meant Osric was wrong about one thing, at least, wrong about the binding breaking clean, but she could not think about that now. She could only think that the man who had warned her away from the north corridors had known exactly what waited in them, and that the friend who had told her which lords to trust had been counting her breaths the whole time. She turned to go, and her sleeve caught the edge of a shelf, and a single book slid and thumped to the floor. The voices stopped. Ceres ran. She did not care how it looked, a queen fleeing down her own corridor with her skirts in her fists. She ran until the west wing was far behind her, and then she rounded a corner and struck something solid and warm and unyielding, and two hands caught her by the shoulders before she could fall. She looked up into Valen's tired dark eyes, and for one instant, before he could arrange his face into its usual cold stillness, she felt it. It came through the place where his hands gripped her, sharp and sudden, and entirely unlike the flat voice that had told her to expect nothing. It was fear. His fear, not hers, bright and specific and shaped exactly like her name. Then he let go, and the feeling vanished as though a door had closed, and his face was a wall again. "What it is," he said. "What has happened?" And Ceres, staring up at the cold king whose terror she had just felt in her own chest, discovered that she had no idea at all which of them she should be afraid of. He walked her back to her chambers himself, one hand hovering near her elbow without ever quite touching it, and he did not ask his question again until the door was shut, and Odalis had been sent away for water they both knew Ceres would not drink. "Now," Valen said, "tell me what put that look on your face." Ceres had spent the walk deciding how much of the truth she was allowed to hand him, and she had arrived at a very small and very careful amount. She could give him the danger. She could not give him the reason because the reason ran straight through the mark on her arm, and the mark was the one thing in the world she could never let him understand. "Your cousin means to see me dead," she said. "I heard him say it plainly in the West Library, with the wine already poured. He was not guessing at my health or hoping for it. He was arranging it. And your kind cousin Izora was sitting at his elbow, agreeing." She watched the words land. She had expected anger, and there was anger, but underneath it, quick and involuntary, came something through the small space between them that had nothing to do with his face. It was not surprise. That was what struck her. He was not surprised at all. He had known Osric was capable of it. He had married her, dressed her in the whole hall's attention, warned her away from the north corridors, all of it, because he had already been counting the same danger she had only just discovered. "You knew," she said slowly. "I suspected," Valen answered. "Suspecting is not the same as being able to prove it before the great families, who would very much like an excuse to prefer him to me. He turned toward the cold hearth as though the dead ashes there required his attention. If I move against Osric without proof, half of Caldmark calls it the act of a frightened king clearing away a rival, and the other half agrees with him. Suspicion is a knife with no handle, grip it and you bleed. So you do nothing, Ceres said. I do what I have done since the night the crown came to me, he said. I watch and I wait, and I give him no soft place to press. And now it seems I keep my wife alive as well, which was not a duty I had planned to want. It was a strange sentence, and she turned it over long after he had gone. The rites began the following night, and the rites were how she came to know him. The binding of Caldmark did not root itself in a single hour. For the first full turning of the moon, the king and his bound queen were required to stand together each night at the old hearth, where the fire had burned without dying for 400 years, and lay their joined hands above the flame while the keeper spoke the old words. Each night the crown sank a little deeper into the mountain, and the man who wore it became a little more truly its king. And each night Ceres knew the silver on her arm climbed a fraction higher toward her heart, and she smiled through it and let no one see. But the rites had one mercy no one had promised her. In the long minutes with her palm laid flat against his, with the heat of the everlasting fire on both their faces and the keeper droning through the dark, she felt him. She felt him the way she had felt his fear in the corridor, only steadier now, and longer, a slow current running up through the place where their skin met. And what she felt, night after night, made a liar of the cold king she had married. On the surface, he was stone. Beneath it, she found a man so tired he could barely stand, a man braced against grief the way a house is braced against a wind that has been blowing for years. She felt his guard go up every time the keeper spoke her house's name. She felt, once, a flare of something warm and startled when she made a dry small joke about the length of the ritual, quickly smothered, as though warmth were a lamp he had trained himself to shutter before anyone could see the light. "Why did you never marry before?" she asked him one night, when the keeper had finished and they were left alone to let the fire settle. Valen was quiet so long she thought he would not answer. "I did want to once," he said at last. "When I was younger and stupider and thought that wanting a thing was the same as being allowed to keep it." He did not look at her. She died. Not by Osric, before you ask. By an ordinary fever, in an ordinary winter, while I was away being a soldier for a crown I did not yet wear. And I learned the lesson that this family teaches all its sons in the end. The things you love are simply the places where the world has learned exactly how to hurt you. So I stopped keeping soft places. It has made me a better king and a worse man, and I had made my peace with the trade until a keeper drew a silver mark on a stranger's arm, and I found I could not stop watching the corridor she walks down. Ceres held very still, because through their joined hands, before he pulled away, she had felt the truth of it move under the words like a fish under ice, and it was not indifference at all. Then he stood, and the wall came back up over his face, and he wished her a cold and formal good night, and left her alone at the fire that was slowly killing her, wondering how a man could tell you he loved no one in a voice that was aching to be believed. The idea came to her 3 nights later, and once it had come she could not put it down. She had been lying awake, as she did now most nights, watching the silver on her arm by moonlight and doing the grim arithmetic of it, when she understood 2 things at once. The first was that Osric would not wait forever, and that every day the court grew a little more restless with a king it thought weak and a queen it thought sickly, gave her husband's enemy a wider road. The second was that there was a way to close that road, and that she held it in her own body. The rooting rites made his crown deeper. But there was a rite beyond them, the old keeper had told her, the full binding, the one that most kings and queens never troubled to complete because it was meant for great love and not for policy. If the 2 of them finished it, if they made the marriage true in every sense the old magic recognized, then the crown would settle into Valen so completely that no living man of the blood could ever pull it loose. Osric's whole scheme rested on the crown one day coming free. The full binding would weld the door shut. It would also, Ceres knew, pour the last of her years out in a single night. The mark would not climb then, it would race. She did not let herself dwell on that part. She had been raised a hostage, and a hostage learns early that her life was never fully her own to spend, and if she was going to spend it, she would rather spend it buying the one man who had ever stood between her and a knife a throne no one could steal. So she went to him. She found him in his study near midnight, bent over maps of the northern passes, and when he looked up and saw her in the doorway, something crossed his face before the stone could cover it, and she felt it too, that same treacherous warmth, gone almost before it arrived. "Ceres," he said, "it is late." "I know what will stop Osric," she said, before her courage could fail. She came into the room and stood across the maps from him with her heart going like a hunted thing. "Complete the binding with me, the full right. Make the crown yours so deeply that his claim turns to ash. He cannot take from a dead queen what has already been welded to a living king." She made herself hold his eyes. "I am offering Valen, freely, tonight, if you will have it." For one moment she thought she had won. For one moment his gaze moved over her face and darkened, and she felt the pull of it in her own chest, the answering want so strong it frightened her. His hand shifted on the map as though it meant to reach across the small distance between them. Then he closed it into a fist and drew it back, and the moment died. "No," he said. The single word went through her like the cold of the mark. She had braced for many answers. She had not braced for the flat refusal, delivered without a reason, in the same even voice that had married her in the great hall. "You do not understand what you are offering," he said. "I understand it perfectly," she said, and she was proud that her voice did not shake. "I am offering to make you safe, to make this marriage mean something instead of standing between us like a locked door. And you will not even. I will not bind you to me more deeply than a keeper's frost already has," Valen said. His jaw was tight. "You came to Caldmark in chains you were too proud to rattle. You did not choose this hall, or this mark, or me. I will not let you weld yourself to a man who married you for a crown simply because his enemy frightens you. It would be the one theft worse than all the rest." He looked away from her. "There is time yet to deal with Osric another way. There is no need for this." He thought he was being kind. She could see that he thought it, could almost feel it, the grim certainty that he was refusing her for her own good, and it did not matter at all, because from where she stood it looked exactly like a man who did not want her turning away from a woman offering him everything she had left. He did not know she was offering him her death. She could not tell him she was, and so the truest, largest thing she had ever tried to give anyone would be filed away in his memory as a frightened girl's overreach, gently declined. "Forget I came," she said. "Ceres." She was already at the door. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, in his own cold, formal voice, and she had the small bitter pleasure of feeling the flinch it caused him before she pulled the door shut and walked away down the dark corridor with her chin up and her eyes burning, and the silver climbing quietly, unhurried now, toward her heart. She did not speak to him for 4 days, and on the 5th day Osric tried to have her killed. It happened at the autumn hunt, which was the one gathering no Caldmark king could skip without looking as though he feared his own forest. The whole court rode out under a hard bright sky, the great families and their hounds and their loud good cheer. And Ceres rode among them because to stay behind would have been to hand Osric the story that the queen was already too weak to sit a horse. Valen kept near her without seeming to, and she kept her face turned from him without seeming to, and the cold thing between them rode along in the space where the two of them refused to look. The horn sounded, the hunt scattered into the trees, and in the confusion of hooves and hounds and shouting, a rider came at Ceres from the side, low over his mount, a short spear leveled at the small of her back. She never saw him. She heard Valen shout her name, felt her own horse wheel hard as a hand seized her reins, and then the world became a single tangle of noise and weight and falling. She hit the leaf mold hard enough to empty her lungs. When she could see again, she was on the ground, and Valen was above her, half turned, and the short spear that had been meant for her had found him instead, struck deep into his side. He had put himself between the point and her body. He had done it, she would understand later, without a heartbeat's thought, the way a man breathes. The rider was already gone into the trees. The forest erupted. Somewhere Osric's voice was rising in perfectly pitched alarm, calling for the guard, calling for a healer, calling loud enough that no one would ever be able to say the king's cousin had not done everything a grieving man could do. Ceres heard none of it clearly. She had her hands pressed hard against the wound in Valen's side, trying to hold him together by will alone, and his face had gone the grey of old snow. They got him back to the keep on a litter of cut branches. The spearhead, once the healers had tended to it, proved to be silver, and its edge had been washed in something that stank of wolfsbane and worse, and Ceres watched the oldest healer's face close like a fist as she smelled it. This was not meant to kill a woman, the healer said grimly, low, so the others would not hear. There is silver in it, and a poison mixed for our kind. Had it struck her, it would have hurt. In him, in an alpha, it is a different thing entirely. It fights the wolf. Her expression grew darker still as she worked. If he lives, and I do not promise it, he may not shift again. The wolf in him is what this was made to burn. They worked over him through the afternoon and into the dark, and nothing they tried seemed to slow the sickness spreading under his skin. And as the light failed at the window, Ceres understood that she was watching him fade for the crime of standing between her and a spear. So when at last she sent the healers out, when she barred the door and knelt alone beside the bed with his cold hand in both of hers, she made the choice she had already known she would make from the moment the point went in. She did not know if the binding could be turned around. She only knew that it ran between them, a road that had carried her life outward into his crown, night after night, and if it could carry life outward, then perhaps, it could carry life the other way. She gripped his hand until her knuckles ached, and she shut her eyes, and she thought of the warmth she had felt in him under all that stone, and she pushed. It hurt. It hurt in a way the nightly rites never had, a deep, dragging cold that started at her heart and ran down her arm and out through her palm. And under her hands his breathing caught and steadied and caught again, and slowly deepened. The sickness under his skin drew back a finger's width, then another. When she opened her eyes, the moon was high, and Valen was breathing like a sleeping man instead of a dying one, and Ceres looked down at her own bared arm in the moonlight and felt her stomach drop away entirely. The silver had climbed past her shoulder. In one night, it had taken back weeks she did not have to give. It lay now at the base of her throat, cold and bright and beautiful, close enough that when she pressed 2 fingers to the hollow of her collarbone, she could feel it there under the skin, waiting, a hand's breadth from her heart. She had bought him his life. She had paid for it with most of what remained of hers. And as she sat there in the dark, shaking, listening to him breathe, she found she could not make herself regret it, and that frightened her more than the mark ever had. Valen woke on the 3rd day, and the first word out of him was her name. He did not know she was in the room. He surfaced from the fever the way a drowning man breaks water, all at once and gasping, and before his eyes had found anything to fix on, he said, Ceres, low and rough and frightened, and she felt the word go into her chest and lodge there. She had been half asleep in the chair by his bed for 3 days, and she came to it now and took his hand, and through the touch, before he had gathered himself enough to hide anything, she felt the flood of it. Relief, bare, enormous relief that she was there, that she was whole, that the last thing he had seen before the dark was not the last thing after all. You are safe, he breathed. I am, she said. You are the one recovering from a spear wound. Do not waste your strength worrying about me. He tried to sit and could not. He tried again, and his legs, when he moved them, moved wrong, sluggish and far away, and she watched the understanding arrive on his face and watched him fold it up and put it out of sight with a soldier's grim economy. The healers came. They said the words they had rehearsed, that the poison had done deep work, that the wolf in him lay quiet and might not rise again, that whether he would ever walk without a stick was a question for time and not for medicine. He thanked them politely. He did not complain. And when they had gone, he lay very still and looked at the ceiling, and Ceres felt, through the hand she had not let go of, the particular grief of a man who has just learned that the thing he was, the strength that made him useful and made him king, may not be coming back. You are still yourself, she said quietly. I am half of myself, he said. An alpha who cannot shift is a lock with the wards filed off. Osric will smell it within the week. He turned his head to look at her at last. You should not tie yourself to what is left. I told you at the hearth to expect nothing. I meant a cold marriage. I did not mean a crippled one. Stop, she said, with more heat than she had meant to show, and she felt his surprise ripple back up her arm. You keep trying to give me reasons to leave you as though you are doing me a courtesy. You took a spear that was aimed at my spine. You have said my name in your sleep for 3 days. You are not a lock with the wards filed off. You are the only person in this entire cold mountain who has ever once put himself between me and the knife. So stop deciding for me what I am allowed to want. He looked at her for a long time. Then quietly, he asked the question she had been dreading since the night the mark leapt to her throat. The wound was closing, he said. I felt it close. In the dark, before the healers, I felt something reach into me and pull the poison back, and it was not their medicine, because their medicine did nothing. It was you. He watched her face. What did you do, Ceres? What did it cost? Nothing, she said, and it was the first true lie she had ever told him, and she felt it curdle between them because he was a wolf, and wolves know the smell of a lie the way other men know the smell of smoke. She saw him catch it. She saw him decide deliberately not to chase it, and she loved him for the restraint, even as it broke her heart, because a man does not choose not to hunt a lie unless he has already guessed it is the kind of truth that will hurt them both. The days that followed were slow and strange. Valen did not mend the way a king is supposed to mend, all at once and triumphant. He mended the way ordinary men do, in small uneven steps, some days a little stronger and some days not, and Ceres stayed for all of it. She learned to read the map of his recovery in the set of his shoulders when he woke. She learned which mornings he would want to be spoken to, and which he would want only to be left in the quiet with her nearby, and she gave him both without being asked, because through the bond she could feel the difference before he had shown it on his face. The court, when word of the poisoning spread, did exactly what he had said it would do. The whispers changed their shape. Where before they had called the queen sickly and the marriage barren, now they began to call the king broken, a wolf that could not run, an alpha in a bed, and Ceres heard the new whispers and hated them with a fierceness that surprised her. She had come to Kaldmark braced to endure its cruelty aimed at herself. She had not expected to find it so much harder to bear aimed at him. When a lady of the court said within her hearing that it was a pity, a crippled king and a dying queen, what a fine pair the mountain had been left with, Ceres turned and looked at the woman, until the woman remembered something urgent elsewhere. She was learning, she realized, to be dangerous on his behalf, and she did not entirely know what to do with the discovery. They took him to her old holdfast to recover, a grey stone house on the edge of the northern woods where an Izmir princess had once been kept quiet and out of sight, and where, improbably, Ceres had been happy as a child. It had been her grandmother's idea to send her there years ago, when the exiled family still had a handful of quiet places to their name, and it was the one corner of the world Ceres had ever been allowed to simply be a child in, unwatched and unjudged. Osric could not easily reach him there, and a wounded king out of sight was a wounded king harder to move against. For a little while in that house, the war and the crown and the climbing silver all seemed to hold their breath. The weeks at the holdfast were the happiest of her life, which was a cruel joke to play on a woman running out of them. She had a chair built for him, low and wide-wheeled, so that on the days his legs would not hold, he could still move through the house under his own hand, and she watched him hate it and use it anyway, because he was not too proud to be helped, only too proud to be pitied, and she had learned the difference. She showed him the frozen pond where she had learned to skate, and the wall she had fallen off at 7, and the little sun-warmed corner of the kitchen garden where the last of the autumn herbs still grew. She talked, and he listened, and slowly, in that quiet house with no court to perform for, the cold king came apart at the seams and let her see the tired kind man underneath. He laughed once at something she said, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and the sound was so unlike anything she had heard from him that she made it her private mission to earn it again. She began to. Every day she stole a little more of him, and every day she felt the mark sit heavier at the base of her throat, and she did not tell him because the arithmetic was the arithmetic and there was no sum in which he could be told. The bond deepened with every touch. It had stopped being a strange leaking of feeling and become a language. She knew his moods before he showed them. She knew the gray days from the good ones by the weight of him in her chest when she woke. And one evening, helping him from the chair to the bench by the fire, her arms around him and his hand at her waist, and their faces a breath apart, she felt his want rise up to meet her own, undisguised at last, no stone left to hide it behind. And she leaned in, and he leaned in, and they were a hair's breadth from the thing they had both been starving for. Then the firelight caught the silver at her throat where her collar had slipped, and Valen went still. She saw him see it. She saw him understand that the mark on her arm had climbed, that it had not settled as the keeper promised, that it had crept up the length of her while he was not watching and now lay a hand's breadth from her heart. And she felt through the place where they touched, the exact moment the pieces fell together in him, the closing wound, the lie she had told, the reaching in the dark, the cost he had asked after and been refused. It is taking you, he said. The binding. It does not feed on the crown at all. It feeds on you. Every right we stood through. Every night I let that keeper root me deeper. He had gone the grey of the day he was speared. Ceres. How long? Do not, she said. How long have you been dying to make me king? She could have kept lying. She was too tired and the mark was too high, and she loved him too much to spend her last untruths on the one person she had never wanted to lie to. Since the hall, she said. Since the first stroke of the keeper's mark. It climbs a little every night, the crown roots deeper, and when I turned it around to pull the poison out of you, it climbed a great deal at once. She touched the cold bright thing at her throat. It is close now. I do not think there are many rights left in me. He was shaking. She had never seen him shake. Then we stop, he said. Tonight. No more rooting. Let the crown come loose, let Osric have the cursed thing. I will not buy it with you. You cannot stop it that way, she said, and here was the last cruelty, the one she had carried alone since a candlelit night in a barred room. It does not release you if the rights simply end. It is a bargain, Valen, and it has a rule, and the rule is the reason I could never tell you. If the king ever learns the cost, the bargain breaks. And a broken binding does not free the blood it was drawing from. It takes them both, king and queen, in the same hour. She met his eyes. You know now, you were never supposed to know. So please, whatever else you do, do not do anything, because the only thing worse than me dying to make you king is you dying beside me for nothing. The silence in that firelit room was the loudest thing she had ever heard. I felt you lie, he said at last, very low. Weeks ago, I chose not to chase it. He put his face in his hands. If I had chased it, if I had made you tell me then, before it broke, we might have. He could not finish. And through the bond, undamned now, she felt the whole terrible weight of him. The grief for the woman he had lost to an ordinary fever laid over the grief for the woman he was losing to an old magic, and under all of it, blazing, the thing he had trained himself never to keep. She felt him love her. There was no mistaking it for anything else, and no wall left to hide it behind. And she understood, with the clarity of someone doing sums for the last time, that his loving her had just become the most dangerous fact in the world. Because a binding fed on years drawn against the blood's will. And a binding between two who freely, fully loved was a different magic entirely, one the old keeper had spoken of once and she had dismissed as a story for great romances and not for policy. She did not know if it was true. She only knew there was one card left in her hand and one night left to play it, and that playing it might save them both or spend the last of her in an instant. She did not tell him what she meant to do. She had learned that much from him. Some choices you do not put to a vote. She waited until he slept because she could not have done it while he was watching her. The full binding did not require the keeper or the old hearth. Those were for show, the old woman had told her, for kings who needed a crowd to believe. The right itself needed only the two bound, and a fire, and the truth freely given on both sides. She had two of the three. The third she would have to gamble on. And the gamble was this, that when she woke him and offered him the full right, the thing that had killed her by half measures when it was policy, might turn in her hand when it was love, and carry life the way it had only ever carried death. If she was wrong, she would pour out the last of herself and die in an hour, and take him with her, exactly as the rule promised. She woke him with her hand against his face, and he opened his eyes, and she watched him surface into the memory of everything and reach for her before he was fully awake. I am going to ask you for something, she said. And I need you to say yes without knowing what it will do, because if I explain it, you will refuse to protect me, and I am so tired of everyone deciding what I'm allowed to spend myself on. She was crying and did not care. Complete the binding with me, the full right, freely, both of us, now. It will kill you, he said. You told me. Every right climbs the mark. Every right so far, she said, was a thing done to me. This one I am choosing. I do not know that it will be different. I believe it might. And I would rather die tonight having wagered on that than live out my handful of days having been too afraid to try. She took his face in both her hands. You told me at the hearth to expect nothing of you. I have expected everything. Give it to me. Say yes. And Valen, who had spent his whole life filing the wards off his own heart so the world would have nothing soft to press, looked at the dying woman holding his face and said yes. The right between two who mean it is a very quiet thing. There was no keeper, no crowd, no everlasting fire. There was only a grey stone room and a low-banked hearth, and the two of them, and the words that rose in her without her having learned them, and his hands warm in hers, and the truth given plainly at last on both sides, spoken and felt at once through the bond that had stopped being a secret and become the whole architecture of them. The silver at her throat flared cold and bright, and began to climb. It reached her heart. She felt it arrive, felt the deep last cold of it. And she thought, with something almost like peace, that she had guessed wrong after all, and she kissed him. She meant it as a goodbye. She knew it for a goodbye even as she gave it, the last warm thing she would ever do, and she poured into it everything she had never been allowed to say. Thank you, and I forgive you the cold hole, and I would do it all again, and I love you, I love you, I love you, and she felt him kiss her back with a fierce, grateful tenderness that told her, even in the dark that was closing over her, that he had misheard it. He thought she was forgiving him. He thought this was the peace between them mended, the cold marriage finally warmed, a beginning. He did not know he was being told goodbye. He kissed her as a man kisses the first morning of a long life, and she let him, because it was a kinder last thing for him to believe than the truth. The cold reached the center of her and stopped, and then it turned. She felt it the way one feels a tide change, that vast slow reversal, the silver that had spent months climbing toward her heart, drawing back from it, and the deep cold running not out of her now but into the space between them, into the bond, and there it met the thing he had stopped hiding and was transformed. The mark receded down her throat, down her shoulder, down her arm, unhurried, cool, retreating like frost off a window when the sun finds it, and where it passed it left her skin bare and warm and unmarked and alive. She broke the kiss, gasping, and Valen pulled back to look at her, and his face was full of joy she had not earned by forgiving him, and confusion beginning to chase it, and she started to laugh and cry at once because she was going to have to tell him. She was going to get to tell him. There was going to be a later in which she could. That was not forgiveness, she said, half laughing, her hand pressed to her own bare, unmarked throat. You beautiful fool. That was goodbye. I was saying goodbye to you. And I mistook it, he said slowly, understanding arriving, the color of it changing everything in his face. You mistook it, she said, and you kissed me back like a beginning. And I think, Valen, I think that is what saved us. I wagered that a bond made of love would carry life instead of taking it, and I was going to be wrong. I felt it reach my heart, and then you kissed me as though we had a whole life in front of us, and the magic believed you. She laughed again, wrecked and radiant. You argued the old magic out of killing me by refusing to believe I was leaving. He kissed her again then, and this time they both knew exactly what it was, and through the bond, wide open and warm and permanent now, she felt his joy break over her like sunrise over the northern woods, and under her own hand, at the small of his back, she felt something she had thought the poison had burned out of him forever, stir, and wake, and rise. The wolf. Not gone after all, only waiting, as she had been waiting, for a reason worth coming back for. They returned to Kaldmark in the first thaw, because Osric had grown bold in the king's long absence, and it was time. The great hall was full again, the same 300 faces, the same cold ceiling that vanished into the dark, and Ceres walked the long grey river of stone toward the old hearth, exactly as she had on the day she was married, save that this time she was not conquered blood being bent, and this time she walked at the side of a king who walked on his own 2 feet without a stick, and this time when the whispers began they were a different kind entirely. Who she is, someone said, though they had all seen her before because the woman who came up the hall now was not the sickly hostage they had counted the breaths of. She was well. She was radiant with it, alive in a way the mark had never let her be, and the court that had left the seats empty on either side of her leaned in now to look. Osric came forward from the crowd, and his warm, handsome face had gone the color of ash, because he of all of them understood what a healthy queen and a walking king meant for a plan built entirely on both of them failing. My lord, he began, cousin, I am overjoyed to see you so. Valen stopped in front of him. He did not raise his voice. He simply let the hall go quiet, and then he let his wolf rise into his eyes, gold and unmistakable and very much not burned out, and Ceres watched Osric understand in one silent moment that everything he had wagered on was gone. There is a matter of a spear in the autumn woods, Valen said pleasantly, and a rider we have since found and questioned at length, and a great many things your library conversations were overheard to contain. He smiled. Shall we discuss them here, cousin? Or would you prefer somewhere with fewer witnesses to your face? They took Osric out through a side door, and Isora with him, and the court that had spent a winter positioning itself around a coming grief was left standing in the wreckage of a plan that had counted on a funeral and got a homecoming instead. Ceres did not gloat. She found she did not need to. She stood at the old hearth where a keeper had once drawn a killing mark on her arm, and she laid her bare, unmarked hand in her husband's, and felt through the bond the steady, warm blaze of him. No wall, no stone, no cold, formal voice, only a man who had once told a frightened stranger to expect nothing and had turned out to be the largest liar in the mountain. "You said I was a key," she murmured, "only for him." "And the lock you were made to open," he answered, "and I have never in my life been so glad to be wrong about anything." They had each been the other's ruin, arranged and paid for, and coldly begun. They had chosen, in a grey stone room at the edge of the world, to be something else instead. And in the end, that choice had proved stronger than the oldest magic in Kaldmark, because the magic had come for her life and been turned away at the door by a man who kissed her like a beginning, and would not, could not, be talked into believing she was gone. Thank you so much for spending this time with Ceres and Valen. Here is what I want to know from you. When she gave him that last kiss and let him believe it was forgiveness, was that a mercy, or was it one lie too many even at the end? Tell me in the comments. I read every one, and I would love to hear where you land. If this story moved you, leave a like so more people find it, and I will see you very soon with another.